Hello and welcome to Agenda AWANI. I'm your host Fahana Sheikh. Now, US President Donald Trump has imposed sweeping tariffs across countries in an effort to protect US industries and level the playing field. Now, this has implications globally and also within the region. So here to discuss this implication is David Stefat, Country Director from Singapore, Dazan Shera and Associates. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Fahana.
Right, okay. David, we want to talk about the implications of these tariffs first globally. So what immediate economic impacts can we expect from Trump's proposed tariffs on the global economy, especially in terms of probably supply chains and also investor confidence?
Excellent question. So basically, a tariff is a tax on imports. So when American companies import goods into the United States, they have to pay this tariff. Now, they can pass that on to consumers or not. Most likely, they will pass it on because they may not be able to bear the costs. So we will see an increase in prices across the US for US consumers. So US consumers will have to pay more. Usually, this depends on the elasticity of products. If prices go up, demand will go down, right? So we would expect there to be less demand for products. Less demand means that like less purchasing orders will be made with overseas companies that supply these goods, right? So we would see demand weaken. We would see prices rising, and we just came off the back of a wave of inflation that has now tempered down, but is likely to go up again. And we will see weakened economic growth. There's an economic term for this, so high inflation, weak economic growth, stagflation. We will probably see the United States heading towards this unless there's any changes in the current tariffs. And there's a risk of a global recession. So economists now warn of a potential global downturn. JP Morgan now is forecasting a 60% chance of a global recession and a contradiction in US GDP for this year. So not great news for the US and the global economy.
Right, it seems like the consequences here are quite, touching at every point, and it has certainly shocked the global market when this was announced. But I would like to know, in your opinion, how might these tariffs actually affect the US economy itself? This is proposed by Donald Trump itself to protect the US industries and also level the playing field. So would this move actually worsen the conditions there, or, especially when you talk about inflation, consumer prices, or even manufacturing competitiveness? What's your thought on this?
Excellent question. So basically, what the Trump administration is saying, we need to balance trade, right? So there were especially harsh tariffs on countries that have a trade surplus with the US. So they send more to the US than they are buying from them, right? And the idea now seems to be that these needs to be balanced. So basically, one country buys from another just exactly the same amount, right? And this is balanced. This is not working. Like, to give you an example, just perhaps in our local economy, if I work for a company, this would be like expecting me then to also buy that company's products, right? Like, but usually an economy doesn't work like this, right? In terms of global trade, there is, for various reasons, whether that's geographic or economic or even the labor cost, like there's variances in different economies, right? Like, so some economies may be able to produce a good like very cheaply. This would not be possible in the US. So, for example, textiles, right? So now, if the US says, okay, very high tariffs on textile imports, there is not necessarily a chance here to build a US industry around textiles. Labor cost in the US is very expensive, so that may not work. You may not see a relocation to the US of these textile factories. Likewise, there are certain goods like coffee, for example. There is no substitute in the US, and the US can't grow it, right? Like, so that would have to be imported. And then asking for other countries to kind of buy US products in return, that might also not work. So the US produces sophisticated goods, aircraft, for example, from Boeing, iPhones from Apple, right? Sophisticated machinery, semiconductors. So you look at NVIDIA, for example, right? Some emerging economies may not have the need for these products or the purchasing power to buy them, right? So, for example, take Cambodia, very hard hit, very small, very poor economy, mostly trading in textiles and other goods. It would be very difficult for them to make up this trade imbalance, as Trump describes it, just by buying more American products, because they may not have a need for these, right? Like, or they are too expensive for them. So, what the US is trying to accomplish here, and the way they are doing it, I see this very problematic, and I don't think it can be addressed. And in the meantime, we have to deal with very high tariffs. So we will have to see how that plays out.
Right. And these tariffs as well impacts the consumer as well in terms of raised prices, right?
That is correct. So the brunt of this, like, because I think Trump was on record several times saying other countries are paying for this. They are not. This is a tax levied on imports, and in the end, American consumers will have to pay higher prices for products that are being imported. And that is something that the US consumer has to deal with. Of course, the US will have certain income from this, right? There will be additional government income because they're
Right.
levying this tax. Then Trump says, oh, maybe in the future there will be tax cuts, but usually tax cuts will not be able to compensate for the higher prices. Because in the end, the consumer will have to pay even more than they could potentially get back via tax cuts or one-off special payments.
Right. So it seems to me that in the short term, we're looking at increased prices and tariffs being imposed to countries. So increase lower purchasing power. In the long term, I think for the Trump administration, like you mentioned, they hope to relocate some of these factories into the US. But like you mentioned just now, this might be a bit problematic for some industries. So we've analyzed a few of the problem areas here. But let's talk about potential long-term consequences of these tariffs on global trade relations and multilateral trade system like WTO. Well, how do you think that will impact, or create a new dynamic in terms of the multilateral trade system that we have right now?
Excellent question. So the goal is here to bring manufacturing back to the US. I addressed why that probably may not work in some industries. Even where it may work, like where there's a potential market, relocating supply chains will take years, right? Like this can take
Right.
up to a decade. There's quite a lot of investment that needs to be made. And then the question is, are companies willing to do this right now in this level of uncertainty? And then, for example, Trump will only be in office for less than 4 years now, right? Like, so maybe then another subsequent US administration will change again. So it may not make that much sense, right? Like, in the meantime, like we will deal with higher prices, uncertainty. And now let's talk about the effect on global trade, right? So I think global trade and a rules-based trading system will continue. It may just be less reliant on the US. So since the end of World War II, the US has heavily pushed the system. It was a net beneficiary of this. The United States is the largest economy in the world. It helped build the system. And now, Trump says there's certain imbalances that he or perceived imbalances that he wants to address. I said, I'm not sure if they can be addressed, and at least not with tariffs, right? You would have to do other things as well. So there should be incentives for companies to relocate manufacturing to the US. And like I said, with the example of textiles, that may not always be possible just because labor costs are so high, right? Now, the trading system will continue, right? Like, so goods will just find other markets, right? Like, so you will probably see more engagement with the European Union, which is a large free trade zone, the largest consumer market actually in the world, even larger than the US consumer market. So there's potentially other trade partners, right? You will also see it ASEAN, for example, inter-ASEAN integration. Countries will try to diversify and not be too reliant on a single market economy to avoid exactly what is happening right now. The impact here, of course, has to be addressed as well because the US is such a large economy. It will have a certain negative impact in the short, medium, and long term unless these tariffs are removed again. But I don't see the international trading system collapsing because of that. I think
Right.
other countries will start working together and countries will look for other markets. So that is
Right.
just what will happening. And trade will continue and then potentially without the United States.
I mean, this is not anything new. I think during the first Trump administration, Trump has already mentioned and already imposed some tariff, although this time it's a bit more aggressive and there's a list of countries and specific percentage for each countries. So it's not anything new, but it does alarm, you know, a lot of countries when certain percentage are a lot higher and certain sectors are being targeted. So I think, like you mentioned, you know, global trade will still continue. It's just a matter of trading off and making sure that we can diversify our exports and imports. Right. So I guess that comes to my next question or next section per se on the implications for Malaysia and ASEAN as a region, right? So Trump's campaign has mentioned a 24% reciprocal tariffs on countries like Malaysia. You know, other ASEAN countries are also, you know, subject to this with different variation, but for Malaysia it's 24%. So Malaysia exports, US is one of Malaysia's main exporting countries. So how would such a move actually affect Malaysia's economy in the immediate and long term? And which sector or industries are most vulnerable to this move?
Mhm. So Malaysia exports 14.8% of its goods to the US. These are semiconductors, of course. They are currently exempt from these tariffs, but perhaps there will be other tariffs in the future. Malaysia has a trade deficit. Sorry, the US has a trade deficit with Malaysia. So Malaysia sells roughly 24.8 billion US dollars more of goods to the US than it buys from the US. So this is why it ended up on Trump's list, and this is why it's being hit with tariffs of 24%. Hardest hit sectors will be electrical and electronic products, excluding semiconductors, because like I said, they are exempt for now, but we would see there will be other announcements, I think, this week and in the near future that may change that. Malaysia also exports machinery, optical instruments, rubber, furniture, palm oil products. So the largest number of goods from the Malaysia's exports to the US are semiconductors, so you wouldn't see any change there. However, of course, that still leaves the other items that I just meant, and here, of course, you will have to deal with less demand because now these products will be 24% more expensive when they reach the United States. So higher prices mean less demand, and then less consumers will buy them. What this means for Malaysia's GDP outlook. So Malaysia had a very positive GDP outlook, I think 5% for 2025. This is revised down now to 4%. So there is still growth, but because of less US demand, there will be less demand for Malaysian products in the US. And that affects, because the US is the second largest trading partner for Malaysia. That's how it affects the country. However, like I said, this can be diversified, right? Like there can be other markets that Malaysia maybe hasn't looked to initially, and that can be explored now. So I think over the next 5 years, let's say the worst case scenario where these tariffs stay in place for the Trump administration, I think these can be offset just by finding alternative markets for Malaysia. So like we won't expect a recession in Malaysia or large layoffs. So I think the effect, while it is there, like I think Malaysia is not one of the hardest hit countries from this.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that, of course, there will be for these industries and, like, for example, also semiconductor manufacturers that sell to the US market, they may see less demand, right? They may scale down operations, but overall, the Malaysian economy, this is just a small part of it, right? Like, so any kind of effects will be limited. Of course, this also depends on how long this is going on. And to give you an example, because Malaysia and the US don't exist in a vacuum, there's other countries as well, right? These trade wars have a negative impact on the global economy, right? Like, so if other countries then are also bad off, then perhaps there will also be a knock-on effect, and there's less demand for Malaysian products from these countries, right? Like, so that is something we have to see how long these tariffs will be in place, right? Like, are there countermeasures by large economies like China? China just now slapped US products exports with 34% tariffs. If the EU does that as well, then maybe we will see overall a bigger effect on the global economy that may also then affect Malaysia more. But for now, there's still economic growth forecast for the country, but it's a difficult and fluid situation. So things may change quite quickly. So we have to see how it plays out.
Should there any immediate actions that Malaysia can adopt to sort of cushion the impact a little bit? You mentioned diversifying export markets. Is that something that Malaysia should look into right away, or maybe strengthening domestic industries that may have, been missed opportunities before this, or even push for more innovation to look into other areas of sector that can be strengthened? What do you think?
So if I were the Malaysian government, so you can do a few things. So first, to address the tariffs, right? Countries can usually do two things. So you can either implement countermeasures. That means you also tariff American goods.
Right.
However, that would hurt your consumer.
Right, and it's not something that Malaysia is looking at as well.
Exactly. And the purpose would be to inflict so much pain on the US to force them to the negotiation table. But because Malaysia-US trade isn't that big, it's not big enough to cause that kind of pain for the US, right? Like, so that wouldn't work. So usually smaller economies would just decide to do nothing, right? Like, so then another option for these economies would be to negotiate, right? Like, so they could meet with the Trump administration and they could see, like, how can we bring down tariffs on our side, which seems to be like perceived the perceived fault here, like that Trump says needs to be addressed. But also, how can we buy more American products, right? Like, so perhaps if there's like a few public deals and stuff, this could be addressed, and then perhaps these tariffs will be removed, right? In the meantime, and in the absence of these tariffs being removed, it would probably makes sense for Malaysia to diversify, right? Like, so to be less reliant on exporting to the US and look for other markets that are also sophisticated and that have a need for these products. And of course, here Malaysia can leverage free trade agreements, right? Like the ASEAN free trade agreement, of course, but also all the other free trade agreements that Malaysia is part of.
Right. I want to look into trade agreements after this, but let's look at the region a little bit, moving away from Malaysia and into, the ASEAN region. Do you think there's any broader implications of this tariffs for ASEAN economies? Some ASEAN economies have been hit quite hard. Thailand, for example, has quite high tariff as well compared to Malaysia. Could this disrupt existing trade flows or investment patterns in the region?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. And when you look at like ASEAN was a net beneficiary of the first Trump trade war during his first administration, right? He was very tough on China. And that led to companies diversify into ASEAN, right? So China plus one strategies. Now they set up manufacturing in Vietnam, for example, or Malaysia, or Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, to just mitigate the risk of a trade war between the US and China. However, now with these rounds of tariffs, ASEAN has been hit hardest. So you look at like 49% tariffs on Cambodia, 46% tariffs on Vietnam. That right now the US, they recognize this, that ASEAN has been benefiting from all of this, and that now some of the trade between China and the US directly shifted to between China, Vietnam, and the US, right? Like to circumvent some of these initial tariffs. Now they clearly putting a stop to that. So it's a very significant impact on ASEAN. Economies like Cambodia, economies like Vietnam, they export heavily to the US, right? They kind of like the economy is built around these exports to the US as a very large market. So that's an issue for ASEAN, right? As a block, and of course for these individual economies that are very exposed to trade, specifically Vietnam and Cambodia. So now the question is, what will happen? How can this be addressed? It could be that like the Vietnamese government already reached out to Trump, right? Like Trump spoke with the chair of the Communist Party there. it could be that these tariffs are waived, right? Like if Vietnam addresses the perceived wrongs that Trump has pointed out. It could also be that they are not, right? And then countries that are heavily exposed to trade with the US, they need to diversify, right? Like so, in general, here diversification is important, right? With other trade partners, whether that's the European Union, for example, whether that is China, Australia, the UK, Canada. Now, these countries should probably explore options, right? And then they should also change their economy in a way that it's not export-led and reliant on a single economy like the US, right? Because diversification is key here.
Right. I mean, I mentioned Thailand, but I completely forgot about Vietnam, who has 46% tariffs on them, which is even way worse. But okay, so diversifying is key here. I think we have mentioned this throughout this session, that diversifying is key. In terms of trade relations, ASEAN in itself has a lot of frameworks to push for greater trade relations, greater unity, greater strength as a bloc. Do you think with this tariffs being imposed, this move being imposed on them, could influence intra-ASEAN trade and economic cooperation even more? Could they potentially push ASEAN members to rely more on each other and to actually make full use of the agreements that they had within them?
Yes, I think that we will definitely see. Plus, of course, the income levels in ASEAN are rising, right? Like ASEAN itself as a bloc will be the fourth largest economy in the world by 2030, right? Like, so there's a rising middle class, higher income. So the market is actually very attractive, right? Like, and then especially via the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, there is potential for a lot of inter-ASEAN trade, right? Like, and I think that definitely needs to be leveraged. But then ASEAN also has free trade agreements with other countries, for example, like China, right? Like and yeah, these need to be leveraged, and of course inter-ASEAN trade, like because these hurdles are all removed, right? Like would be something to look at, because right now I think inter-ASEAN trade is still limited, and that would definitely be an option to offset any impact from like tariffs that were imposed by the US, right? Like, so I think we will definitely see a move towards more regional integration, right? Like, because here the barriers have already been removed, but we will also see other markets outside of ASEAN that will become more attractive for ASEAN manufacturers to export to. In general, like economies trade with each other. This is so they address imbalances that they have themselves. So because they couldn't produce a certain good, so they import it, right? And then they export what they're really good at producing, right? Like, so trade is win-win and not a zero-sum game as Trump sees it, right? Like, so we would definitely expect there to be more integration amongst countries that seem to be very hard hit right now. And they will most likely try to reduce dependencies on the United States.
I mean, two things here that I notice is, one, there has been critiques of ASEAN's not making full use of its trade agreement or its trade relations within ASEAN, and two is the lack of attention, I guess, when it comes to the Trump administration looking into trade and engaging with ASEAN. So maybe with this move, those two could be corrected, and maybe could push for stronger unity and stronger, unit or bloc with ASEAN. So who knows, right? Right.
Exactly. Who knows? But it will probably work towards more integration. And as a result, like result, ASEAN will be stronger for it.
Right. I have one last question, if we can keep it. We're almost running out of time, but I have one last question to sort of wrap up, and looking ahead at the kind of situation that we're in, the kind of landscape that we're in right now. Is there a risk that these protectionist trends now being put forth by the US could trigger a broader global trade war? And how should countries like Malaysia position themselves in such a scenario? I think this is very much looking ahead at what's to come and where we lie.
Yeah, excellent question. And like I mentioned earlier, like if there's a tit for tat reaction by large trade blocs like China and the European Union, for example, that would probably cause a lot of economic disruption across the globe. I think ASEAN may benefit from this, right? Like Malaysia may benefit from this because they wouldn't be target of these retaliations, right? Like because that would be plainly targeted at the US. So there's definitely potential for trade with other countries like China and trade blocs like the European Union. But the overall effect on the global economy may be quite bad, right? Like, so trade was unlike for everyone. Trade is usually win-win. And of course, sometimes there's imbalances. I'll give you an example. Like when you look at the automotive industry in the US, right? Like they had to deal with Japanese imports in the 1980s. And then cities like Detroit, they were kind of, I don't want to say losing, but they were affected, right? And then usually how countries should deal with this is retrain, right? Like, so you want to make sure that your workers are taken care of. Not every industry will be successful. And as you are exposed to international trade, that means sometimes for your home industries, these may be affected. And then you need to find a way of dealing with this. Either you need to raise more competitive companies and you need to see how you can help them be competitive, or you need to retrain workers so they can be employed in other sectors of the economies. That is usually how countries should deal with it, because you want to minimize the backlash, right? Like, so there are some downsides to trade and international economics, but in general, you are better off by benefiting from lower prices, and that benefits every consumer. And usually, these advantages outweigh the negatives.
Right. I mean, I think, I mean, to sum up, it's assessing and taking a step back at addressing this and finding opportunities like diversifying export markets or strengthening industries at home, or even increasing trade relations with other countries, and relying on the bloc that you already have, for example, with Malaysia, relying on ASEAN for intra-trade relations. So it's about, I feel, from my point of view, is taking a step back and dealing with a problem more positively, if that makes sense. Right. Thank you so much, David, for your insights. And I think this situation is developing. There's a lot more to come in the next few months or so. Who knows? We'll just be on the lookout, me and you, and we'll be here to analyze the situation and provide the audience with much needed analysis of hopefully not a global trade war in the future. But thank you so much, David. That's it. That's all from me. I'm Vanashe. Thank you for watching.